Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. This is episode 50, which is crazy to think about. So, to start our 50th episode, Sarah from Morocco asks, any theory why blind people don't develop schizophrenia?
Well, this is a mighty unexpected question and might seem implausible right off the bat. But since the 1950s, there's been evidence that people who have schizophrenia do not get a certain type of blindness. Okay, what kind? Congenital. There's you lose your vision over the course of your lifetime and old age, macular degeneration, whatever. Congenital, you were born blind. What type of blindness? You can have a problem out in your eyes, your retina, for example, retinitis pigmentosa, or in the optic nerve connecting your eyes to your visual cortex, or in this case, the problem is in the visual cortex, congenital cortical blindness, which is extremely rare. And apparently, starting in the 1950s, people were noticing, hey, you never see someone with schizophrenia who has congenital cortical blindness. Hey, you never see anyone with congenital cortical blindness who has schizophrenia. So this was a very unlikely thing to spot, especially since what you see is when blindness comes on anytime after age 5, 6 or so, that increases the likelihood of a psychosis. Likewise, if you lose your hearing after, so the notion amid a backdrop of sensory loss is associated with an increased risk of schizophrenia related psychoses. There's this weird observation that nonetheless you don't see an overlap between schizophrenia and people with congenital cortical blindness. Okay, so what's that about? It's at this point that the scientists came in, and it turns out there's been two ways of doing science about this. First one is to systematically call up people who study large populations of people with schizophrenia and say, hey, do you ever see anyone with congenital cortical blindness? Then to call up people on the other side of it and say, do you ever see anyone? And no one's ever seen anyone. Okay, some slightly better science done with that, which is you do a big epidemiological survey. And the biggest one that's been done so far has been in Australia, Western Australia, and involved almost 500,000 subjects looking at who gets schizophrenia, who's got congenital cortical blindness. So what did they see from this massive survey? They found a little bit short of 2,000 people out of the 500,000 who had schizophrenia relatively early in life, another 9,000 people who had some sort of psychosis. So it's about 11,000 people or so. And amid this 500,000 people, there were 66 people with congenital cortical blindness. That is not a lot of people among a 500,000 or so. Again, this is a very rare type of blindness. So then, of course, the question becomes how many people in this 500,000 had both schizophrenia and congenital cortical blindness, and there were no cases of it? Wow, 500,000 people to sift through, and no one ever sees it. Well, you don't see the two of them going together. So at this point, all the spoil sport statisticians came in there and started to say, well, with 9,000, 11,000 cases or so of psychosis and schizophrenia, crossed with 66 cases of congenital cortical blindness, how many cases would you expect to see if there was no relationship, if they were independent events? And it turns out you crunch the numbers and it predicts that out of every 500,000 people, you should see zero point 0.6, 6/10 of one person should have both schizophrenia and congenital cortical blindness. So this is not a very useful number when translated into actual reality. What you get is if in that population you see nobody with schizophrenia plus this type of blindness, what you assume, what you conclude is, whoa, that's occurring at a lower rate than would be expected. On the other hand, if you see one person with both, what you conclude is you see a higher rate than expected. If it's zero point 0.6 is the expected value, 0 is less than you would expect. Whoa, that's interesting. This type of blindness and schizophrenia don't seem to go hand in hand. On the other hand, if there was one case, you would say, whoa, this is interesting. For some reason, this type of blindness and schizophrenia are more likely to go hand in hand. Okay, so that shows you the limitation of doing statistics on rare events. Flipped a different way, you look at all of the United States and you look at the incidence of this type of blindness and you look at the incidence of schizophrenia and you assume they are independent events. They have nothing to do with each other. What would you expect to see? It turns out you would expect to see about 600 cases of people with both schizophrenia and congenital cortical blindness. And instead, as far as anybody can tell, you've never seen any cases of this at all. So, amid the statistical limits of a survey of 500,000 people or so, the most prudent conclusion is if you ever see both occurring, it is very, very rare. There does legitimately appear to be a reason why schizophrenia and related psychosis in general and this type of blindness do not go hand in hand. That seems to be for real. So, of course, at this point, you ask, how come? What's going on here? And a recent paper, a 2020 paper, speculated on why you don't see schizophrenia in individuals with congenital cortical blindness. And this paper had a sentence in it, which was the most frightening thing I have read as of late. And believe me, I've been reading a lot of news recently that is frightening. But this paper included the sentence, the brain is a Bayesian inference machine, which is terrifyingly abstract in terms of talking about how the brain processes probabilities. And that's the sum of my knowledge about Bayesian probability. But in any case, this paper did all these Bayesian simulations of schizophrenia and this type of blindness and what it could tell you about certain attributes of, and this is what the authors came up with. And their speculations as to what's happening. They would say individuals with this type of blindness, quote, rely more heavily on the context they extract from the other senses. And the resulting model of the world is more impervious to the false inferences. What's this mean? You normally got your five senses, and like the kid is born, and the four remaining senses sit there and say, well, I guess it's up to us. And they say, well, what do you know? I guess we just have to toughen up here and be more sensible. You, auditory cortex, don't get suckered in considering internal thoughts to actually be voices talking to you. You, olfactory cortex, don't go and have olfactory hallucinations. It's like this toughening up that the sensory system does right at birth. It's like you take the newborn and you force them to do Pilates or something. And somehow this is a more sensible sensory system forever after, not to get suckered into having delusions and hallucinations because they've had to hang together or they would hang separately starting from birth. This is the most plausible model. Another version of the same idea is loss of one sensory system at birth will induce neuroplasticity. Yeah, the other four remaining senses have to take up the load and they get more robust and they map their axonal projections more broadly. And the brain is like compensating. And as part of this compensation, all this compensatory plasticity, somehow in there, you're less likely to succumb to this disorder, schizophrenia. So that's the state of the field. The evidence is circumstantial, but I think it's kind of compelling. Why this happens is pure speculation at this point, but one of those very, very odd findings in the field.
Next, Janady from Dominican Republic says, let's say that the government accepts that punishment and meritocracy are ridiculous. Is there a way they can use the information and determined the wrong way?
Oh, very easily, very dramatically. When you start getting people thinking about that there may not be any free will, of course, they say, oh my God, everyone's going to run amok. That's the first worry, and that takes a lot of work to take people through a literature suggesting people would not run amok. They also then say, oh, what are we going to do in terms of a criminal justice system? We can't have murderers running around in the streets, and that's a challenge also, but it is a solvable one, which is a whole other story. Then they'll say, oh, how do we motivate people to work hard if we don't give them prestige and a sense of moral worth just because they happen to be good at memorizing stuff? And that's a whole problem too. But the biggest problem, I think, and the biggest danger is when our hypothetical government here confuses determinism with predeterminism. Okay, just to get all eggheady about this to start off, predeterminism, Calvinists and religious predeterminist godly interference with human affairs. And what's the predeterministic view, which is 2 seconds after the Big Bang, if you could understand where every single little itty bitty ion and quark was in the universe, you would know everything that's going to happen. The future is already set. And this is a predeterministic view. And note that what comes out of that is the single most dangerous thing for a government to conclude, or for anyone to conclude, from the notion that there's no free will, which is to let predeterminism erroneously sneak in the back door and reach the conclusion, thus, nothing can be changed. That's the danger, and that's the huge mistake. In actuality, a deterministic world, which I think we live in, is in no way contradictory with the notion that change can happen. As we sit here right now in this moment, there are multiple possible futures. And that's because of chaoticism and nonlinear systems and three-body problems multiplied umpteen orders of magnitude and emergent complexity and all of that. There is still multiple possible futures. Let's make that less eggheady and just turn it into, yeah, people change, societies change, and noting and glorying in some cases and learning from change is completely compatible with there being no free will. Once again, we change dramatically amid no free will. And once again, as I've emphasized previously, no doubt ad nauseum by now, we do not choose to change. When change occurs, we are changed by circumstance as a function of what prior circumstances have turned us into, who we are at that moment. And within that framework, change is absolutely possible. That is clearly the case every time you listen to some, I don't know, podcast. Is this thing a podcast? I have no idea what we are. Is this a TV? Is this a musical? You listen to one of these and you learn that you can reject determinism and still there's room for change to occur. And as a result of that, you are changed by this. Changed, maybe you decide you're going to give up on this and just go watch 90 Day Fiance. Or maybe you decide that, oh, it is completely compatible to have change and this being a deterministic world without free will to go hand in hand. And the big danger, of course, is if anyone, and especially those in power, conclude that the logical response to there being no free will is nothing can change. Don't bother. Don't bother because nothing changes. And thus, what we have now is, oh, I don't know, let's not mistake is with should. No one is going to necessarily say that the system we have right now is what it should be. Nonetheless, this is what we got and it can't change. And that is utterly wrong. And the most dangerous thing anyone could do, including governments, is decide that rejecting the notion of free will means don't bother trying to change things.
If anyone knows the movie Minority Report, that's an example of how a predeterministic mindset leads to inaccuracy and an incorrect structure. So All right. Finally, Zach from Colorado says systems of commerce and trade have dominated much of human interaction and culture. Are there forms of barter and trade observed in other species, especially our closer relatives? Have there been any studies that observe a beneficial advantage in species which have some form of cooperative exchange?
Well, the fast answer is no, hasn't really been observed. The better answer is no, it hasn't really been observed, but something kind of like it has been observed that is way, way interesting. Okay, bartering systems, human universals, it's great, it makes for peace. Uh, Countries that exchange goods across their borders don't send armies across their borders, except that turns out not to always be true. But what about in other species? We get back to oh so many episodes ago when we were looking at some of the principles of sociobiology. What are the building blocks of thinking about the evolution of behavior? Animals behave to maximize their own reproductive success, to leave copies of their genes. Sometimes they do so individually out of individual maximization. Sometimes they help close relatives who share genes with them. But then the third arm was reciprocal altruism. There's all sorts of circumstances where cooperation pays off. And that could be shown in all kinds of species where cooperative hunting behavior, and you have a higher rate of taking down a kill. Wild dogs are a terrific example of that. Um, so you see reciprocal altruism. We also saw the dark underbelly of it, which is where game theory comes in, which is in an ideal world, everyone you're dealing with is altruistic reciprocally, and they're great. And what you do is you cheat and exploit them, and thus the evolution of cheating strategies, and thus the evolution of defensive strategies against it, all of that. So within that framework, do you see something that looks like reciprocal altruism in a more close to home way in close species and primates? And yeah, absolutely. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Grooming behavior. And you see reciprocity going on. You see baboons, who grooms who. Some of it is built around rank, as in if somebody's sufficiently scary enough, shows up and demands that you groom their back, that tends to happen. So there's all sorts of rank asymmetries. But overall, there's a lot of reciprocity going on there. Grooming partners tend to be stable individuals who groom each other. Long-term affiliation. Something else that you see in other primates is food sharing, which is really getting close to sort of bartering physical goods instead of just picking insects out of somebody else's shoulder coats there, or some such thing. Food sharing is seen in a bunch of primate species, chimps, orangutans, and you don't share food with just anyone. You share food with somebody who you have a prior relationship with. What's your prior relationship? A history of stable reciprocity. Bats are sort of the supreme example of that. Bats who have these big colonies of individuals who aren't necessarily related, and they feed each other's babies with all sorts of reciprocity rules. Okay, so we have exchange of services here, but that's not what really the question is about. Do you get primates who give bananas to this guy there in order to get back, I don't know, a Game Boy or something? Is there material goods that are exchanged in reciprocal relationships in other species? And the answer is, in the wild, nobody has seen that. It is possible, though, to generate that in experimental settings in a lab. And this was some absolutely fascinating work done by Laurie Santos and colleagues at Yale University some years ago, capuchin monkeys, where they taught these monkeys about economics. They gave them little tokens, which, weren't fun to bite on, and you couldn't fling it at anyone very effectively. And what they gave instead was abstract value to the tokens. Could the monkeys learn, and indeed they did after a whole bunch of trials, to take a token and go up to the human there and stick it out to them and buy something from them. What would you buy if you were a capuchin? Something great, something terrific. A grape which is wonderfully pleasurable for a capuchin monkey, or in a piece that violates all of primate evolution but nonetheless makes a lot of sense, a little piece of jello which capuchin monkeys loved, and they could learn to generate an exchange system. I give you this material thing, this weirdo token thing, which I've now been conditioned to see as having value. I give it to you, and you give me some jello in exchange. And this got worked out just fine. So that's great. Then you see some of the features of it were very rational in exactly the same ways as in us, which is you got the monkey, and maybe some of the time they want jello, and some of the time they want grapes, and they're going about their desires in the world. And suddenly there's inflation. There's inflation. The same little plastic token that used to get you a piece of jello now gets you half a piece of jello. Oh my God, what happened? When did the price double on it? And what do you see is the monkeys do exactly the logical thing. They say, screw this, double the price of jello. I'm not getting any more jello. They shift all of their buying over to grapes in the economic way of framing that. They are adhering to rules of utility maximization exactly as a human would do. Yeah, they're even able to have rational economic behavior just like in us. And then it turns out they can have irrational economic behavior just like in us as well. And you take advantage of this phenomenon called loss aversion. Here, you need to gamble, and you're you willing to gamble, and you take a risk, you pay a token or whatever. And if it turns out to be great, you get a reward. Okay, are you willing to do it? Other version, here's a reward. Let's take a gamble, pay your token, and if things don't turn out well, you got to give the reward back. In one case, a bad outcome is you don't get the reward. In the other case, the bad outcome is you got to give back what you already possess. And humans hate the latter circumstance, even though logically they're exactly the equivalent. But humans have this very strong, irrational loss aversion. Once you possess something, you way distort, overinflate its value. And it turns out these monkeys would do the exact same thing. Here, we're going to put your grape over here and it's yours. You can have it. But if you want to get involved in this, like, game here today, and you're willing to invest a token, you can get a second grape if things turn out well. But if things turn out badly, we're going to take that grape away from you. And it turned out, even though it is logically exactly the same as taking a chance of getting a grape before you possess one, capuchin monkeys show the exact same risk aversion, loss aversion that humans do. So that's totally cool. Okay, so they don't come up with barter economies on their own of trading little pieces of plastic for jello, but they can do it in theory, in actuality, in experimental settings. But now comes the unexpected punchline. And this was work by Franz de Waal, amazing primatologist. We lost him last year. Totally amazing work on every aspect of primate social complexity. And this was a study he did, and he didn't do any sort of manipulation. He just kind of noticed a pattern and then documented it. He had a group of captive chimps, and you'd occasionally put out some real desirable food. And what happens? The high ranking males monopolize it. And as I noted earlier, under some circumstances, they would share the food. They would share the food with an individual. They had a long history of reciprocal cooperation and a fight, coalitional partners, things like that. But then Duvall noted an interesting pattern, which he noticed that a lot of the time when a male shared food with a female, shortly beforehand, she had come up and sexually presented to him, and they had had sex. I kid you not. This was there in the data. A female who would initiate sexual behavior with a male was more likely for him to share food with them afterward. Whoa, okay, what are we seeing here in this experimental setting at Emory University in Georgia, in a state that I'm sure frowns upon non-human primate women of the night, or whatever the term is. What are we seeing here? So immediately, some of the chimp experts on chimps out in the wild reported that no, you don't see that, something like that. This is some sort of artifact of chimp captivity. But then you began to see that in feral populations of dogs, high-ranking individuals are more likely to share food with a female they recently had sex with. Wolves, the same thing, the same exact pattern. And wolves are especially interesting because wolves pair bond, they're monogamous. So this is not like, ooh, yeah, how about some action here? And you can have this dead carcass that I've been gnawing on. You can share it with me. In exchange, we will form a sexual partnership. They already have one. They're already pair bonded. So that puts a lot of puzzling motivation into it. And then people observed the same thing in bats. Bats are more likely to share food, male bats, with a female they've had sex with recently. What to make of this? I have no idea. This is some approximation of the material economy, but it sure looks familiar to seemingly every culture on Earth. This is a phenomenon that has now been seen in a number of species. You don't see it in chimps in the wild, but you see it in some other species as well. What do you make of that? How should we interpret that and our evolutionary roots? I don't know, but that is interesting as hell.
Well, and sort of a callback to an episode from quite some time ago. So corvids, like crows and ravens, are extremely intelligent, and there's been a lot of reports of people establishing trading or bartering like relationships with wild crows, where they would be leaving food out for them, and the crows begin to bring them little trinkets like shells or really cool stones. So there's something to be said for that, I guess. And that's it for episode 50. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.